Victims of the 7th of July bombings in London were let down by inadequate emergency planning, according to a report by the Home Office. Emergency workers were praised for their bravery and professionalism, but the report agreed that procedures need to be quickly improved. It does, however, reject demands from some survivors for a full public inquiry, maintaining that it would divert valuable resources from the fight against terror. James Blake reports.
This is now the 5th official report into the London bombings on July 7th. Based on interviews with families and survivors, it is an opportunity for the Home Office to express what lessons it has learnt. But it also reveals just how underprepared and overwhelmed the emergency services were on that day. Injured victims were left unattended and untreated. Families were forced to travel from hospital to hospital in a desperate search for their loved ones. And police call centres couldn't cope with 40,000 calls an hour.
The report lists 17 major failures in the response after July 7th. Most highlight a lack of communication. There were no hospital liaison staff and no reception centres for relatives and victims. Crucial information was not shared between police and agencies because of data protection worries, and victims described the compensation process as bureaucratic, slow and distressing.
It took more than an hour for the emergency services to get into the tunnel at Russell Square, so the station staff became responsible for the response. Earlier in the year, Channel 4 News spoke to the duty manager on that day.
The emergency services actually were approximately over an hour before they arrived. But at the time, I was wondering why they are not here. But now I realize, because we were not aware of the wider situation. No, we realized that there were incidents, there was attacks at Edgware Road and Aldgate, so there was a lot of traffic, a lot of chaos.
In 2003, London's contingency planners staged an exercise on how to control the chaos after a terrorist attack. This had been the time to learn lessons. Yet 2 years later, when the inevitable happened, simple things like police radios not working underground had still not been solved.
I wouldn't want from today's report a single emergency worker to take this as criticism of them. I take entirely the failures that occurred, where they did occur, as to be failures of strategic planning.
No one doubts the actions of emergency workers saved lives. This report doesn't blame any individual. Instead, it exposes a serious system failure. It may satisfy some families, and yet in the introduction, the Home Secretary still maintains a public inquiry would add nothing to our understanding of that day.
Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Rachel North, one of the survivors of the London bombings, who's been campaigning for a full independent public inquiry. And I started by asking her for her reaction to the Home Office report.
Well, it's good that they've sat down and listened to survivors and bereaved family members over the summer. It does reiterate a great deal of what was already said earlier this year in the spring in the London Assembly report, which looked at the response of London to a major disaster such as July 7th, and which interviewed publicly many survivors for the first time, and which caused quite a scandal at the time, because up until then people just hadn't been aware of quite how chaotic it was and how the planning and the systems hadn't functioned as well as they could have done on the day.
So what's missing?
Well, what's missing, I think, is a wider debate, which government have had the opportunity to do and haven't taken up, about the causes of July the 7th. What we're looking at is the effects of July the 7th, but not where it came from. And there isn't anybody, for example, who can tell us now how safe we are, what the current risk from terrorism is.
But is that the kind of thing you could get from a public inquiry? I mean, there are no definitive answers on that kind of thing, are there?
There is currently no one single independent investigation of the facts relating to where July 7th came from, what happened on the day and what happened afterwards. So if anybody watching this programme wants to find out more about July 7th, what they have to do is go to a series of different reports, some of which actually contradict each other, none of which are independent, most of which are internally focused, and sift them all and cross-reference them all in order to try and find out what happened, in order to answer a question that I think everybody's concerned with, which is how safe am I moving around in the United Kingdom today from terrorism?
Do you accept the government's sincerity, though, when they say these are not things that should necessarily be the subject of a public inquiry? It wouldn't necessarily be helpful to national security, apart from anything else.
Well, a public inquiry, I think the government have been kind of frightened off by previous public inquiries, but since the Public Inquiries Act, they are now able to set the terms of what a public inquiry can cover. So an independent investigation where all information is one place is something that I think is possible and would be helpful. Some parts of it may have to be off-screen, but as much as possible should be in the public eye, because it's in the public interest to know what the threat to the public is. So